Okay guys, quick question before we get into anything else. You ever date someone who was, on paper, completely perfect? For you, same values, good job, funny, kind to waiters, all of it, and you still didn't pick them. You picked the messier option, the one that was easier to be around, even if you couldn't fully explain why on a spreadsheet. Yeah, you know exactly who I'm talking about. We've all done it. We look at the objectively correct choice and go, nah, I'm gonna go with the one that just feels easier. Alright, switching gears today, no more of that. Because it turns out an entire multi-billion-dollar global industry did the exact same thing for almost 20 years, on purpose. And the objectively correct choice they walked away from wasn't a person. It was a piece of film, a specific, physical format of photographic film that was sharper, cleaner, and more professional than anything Kodak was selling to regular people, and Kodak buried it anyway, using a worse version of the same idea, and made an absolute fortune doing it. I'm talking about 35mm film versus Kodak's own 126 and 110 cartridge formats. And guys, I promise you, the gap in quality here is not subtle. This is not some nerdy photography forum argument about which lens has nicer bokeh. This is a full stop, night and day difference in image quality, and Kodak knew it the entire time. And before you say, okay, but who cares? It's just old film, I want you to sit with this for a second. This isn't a story about nostalgia. This is a story about how an entire industry, run by extremely smart engineers who absolutely knew better, chose worse on purpose, and got rewarded for it, over and over again, for 2 decades straight. That should bother you a little. It bothers me. Let's get into it. So let's start with the numbers, because they are wild. A standard 35mm negative measures 24mm by 36mm. That's the frame size. That's been the professional and semi-professional standard since the 1920s. Kodak's own 126 Instamatic cartridge, launched in 1963, shrank that down to a roughly 28 by 28mm square, smaller total area, worse aspect ratio for enlarging. Then in 1972, Kodak did it again with the 110 cartridge. That one's frame size dropped to just 13 by 17mm. Do the math on that for a second. That's less than a quarter of the light gathering, detail capturing surface area of a 35mm frame. Less than a quarter. You are cramming the same amount of visual information Kodak's professional grade film could capture into a space smaller than a postage stamp. And the results showed it. Camera magazines at the time, including Modern Photography, ran resolution tests comparing formats, and high-quality 35mm lenses were measured resolving somewhere north of 90 line pairs per millimeter under good conditions. You didn't get anywhere close to that kind of sharpness out of a 110 cartridge, because the negative was so small that any enlargement passed. A basic snapshot print turned into a soft, grainy mess. Photography historians and film labs today will tell you the same thing plainly. 110 negatives are, and I'm not exaggerating here, notoriously difficult to enlarge cleanly because there just isn't enough physical film to work with. Think about that in real terms for a second. Blow a 110 negative up to a normal 8x10 print, and you're stretching 13mm of information across 10 inches of paper. That's an enormous amount of magnification for a tiny scrap of film, and grain that was invisible in your hand becomes a fuzzy, sandy mess on the wall. Meanwhile, a 35mm negative, with more than 4 times the surface area to work with, could get blown up just as big and still hold detail, because there was simply more actual information recorded on the film in the first place. Grain in photography works kind of like pixels in a digital photo. The smaller the sensor, or in this case, the smaller the negative, the harder every single one of those grains has to work, and the uglier it gets the second you push it past its limits. And it wasn't only Kodak's own film in these cartridges either, which makes this even weirder. Companies like Agfa, Fujifilm, Konica, and Ilford all licensed and manufactured film for the 126 format too, because the market was so enormous, nobody wanted to be left out. So this wasn't Kodak quietly cutting corners. Nobody else could match. This was a worse format, so commercially dominant that Kodak's own direct competitors were racing to build product for it, instead of trying to pull the market back toward 35mm, where the technology clearly had more room to shine. So here's the puzzle, guys. Here's the thing that should not make sense. If 35mm was sitting right there, invented decades earlier, proven, sharp, flexible, why did millions and millions of everyday people in the 60s and 70s seconds hand over their money for a format that Kodak's own engineers knew was objectively blurrier. Why would the company that literally also sold the superior 35mm film choose to build its biggest, most iconic consumer product line around? The worst one? Buckle up, because the answer isn't one thing. It's 5 things, stacking on top of each other, and every single one of them has nothing to do with image quality. Let's go back to the beginning first, because you need to understand just how untouchable 35's reputation was before any of this started. 35mm as a still photography format traces back to a German engineer named Oskar Barnack, working at Leitz, the company that would become Leica, in the early 1900s. Barnack had a lung condition that made lugging around the huge glass plate cameras of the era physically miserable for him. So he started experimenting with repurposing 35mm motion picture film, which was already standardized for the movie industry, into a small, portable still camera. By 1925, Leica released the Leica I to the public, and it changed photography permanently. Suddenly, you had a camera you could carry in one hand, loaded with enough film for 36 exposures, capable of extremely sharp results. Photojournalists loved it. War photographers loved it. It became the backbone of serious photography for the rest of the century. That's the pedigree we're talking about. This isn't some obscure format. This is the gold standard. So why didn't everybody just use that? Here's cause number 1, and it's the one that actually gets a lot of the blame historically. 35mm cassettes in the mid-20th century were genuinely annoying to load. You had to pull the film leader out, thread it precisely onto a take-up spool inside the camera, wind it forward carefully to make sure the sprocket holes caught, close the back, and hope you did it right. All of this often in dim light, because you obviously can't do it in bright sun without fogging the film. Get it slightly wrong, and you'd walk around for an entire vacation thinking you were taking pictures, only to open the camera later and discover the film never actually advanced. No pictures. Nothing. Just vibes. Kodak knew this was a massive pain point because customers complained about it constantly. So in 1963, a Kodak engineer named Hubert Nerwin designed a fix, the 126 cartridge, marketed as Kodak. It was a simple, foolproof, drop-in plastic cassette. You popped it into the camera, closed the back, and you were done. No threading, no fumbling, no ruined rolls. It was such an obviously good idea for casual users that Kodak patented the design, and it was, quote, a bombshell success, immediately copied by camera makers all over the world. And when Kodak went even smaller in 1972 with the 110 pocket Instamatic system, they weren't just chasing convenience anymore. They were chasing size. A camera that could genuinely fit in a shirt pocket, not just a bag. So compounding cause number 1 is pure friction. 35's superior image quality meant nothing to somebody who couldn't load it correctly in the first place. A blurry photo that exists beats a perfect photo that never got taken because you fumbled the spool. That's not a knock on people's intelligence. By the way, that's just how humans behave when a task has too many steps between them and the thing they actually want. The format that removed steps won, regardless of what it cost them in sharpness. And Kodak understood this at a level that borders on genius, honestly. This wasn't some accidental discovery. The Instamatic's cartridge design, credited to Nerwin, was engineered specifically so it was physically asymmetric. You could not put it in the camera the wrong way, even if you tried. There's no leader to find, no sprocket to align, no dim room fumbling. You open the back, you drop it in, you close it, done. Eastman Kodak literally patented the shape of "can't mess this up," and that patent, number 3,138,081, became one of the most consequential pieces of intellectual property in the history of consumer electronics. Because it didn't just sell a product, it sold the removal of a fear, the fear of coming home from your one and only trip to the Grand Canyon and discovering you got 0 usable pictures the whole time. Cause number 2, nobody needed the sharpness. They were giving up. Here's the thing that I think is the real gut punch of this whole story. The vast, overwhelming majority of the people buying Instamatics and pocket Instamatics were not printing giant enlargements. They were getting basic drugstore prints. The classic 3.5 by 5-inch snapshot to drop into a photo album or mail to grandma. And at that small print size, the difference between a 35mm negative and a 110 negative is genuinely hard for an untrained eye to notice. The grain and softness that photography nerds and lab technicians could measure with a loupe and a resolution chart simply did not show up in the size of print regular families were actually making. Kodak wasn't selling image quality to this crowd. It was selling good enough, and good enough at a smaller, cheaper, more convenient package beat technically superior every single time, because the extra quality was invisible in the way people were actually using it. This is a classic case of a spec that only matters in a lab. On paper, 35mm crushes 110. In your actual living room, looking at a snapshot the size of an index card, you cannot tell the difference. And when the better spec doesn't translate into a better real-world experience for the customer, the better spec loses every time. Here's the kicker though, it wasn't just that people didn't need the sharpness, it's that most of them never even saw a side-by-side comparison to miss it in the first place. Nobody's uncle at the barbecue was holding up a loop next to prints going, yes. Notice the increased acuteness on the 35mm sample. People just looked at the picture grandma sent back from Florida, thought, great, that's grandma at the beach, and moved on with their lives. The entire technical argument that photography enthusiasts were having in magazines simply never reached the dinner table of the actual customer. And a superior spec that nobody in the room is even aware of might as well not exist. Cause number 3. Kodak completely redefined what the product was even for. This is the part that I think is genuinely brilliant. In a slightly evil way, Eastman Kodak's whole company philosophy traces back to George Eastman's original slogan from way back in the 1880s. You press the button, we do the rest. That sentence is the entire strategy. Kodak was never really selling cameras or film as precision optical instruments. They were selling effortless memory making, a tool for capturing your kid's birthday, your family vacation, your grandmother's 90th. The category Kodak built wasn't photography equipment, it was family memories, made easy. And once you reframe the product that way, resolution and grain structure stop being the metric that matters. Ease, reliability, and portability become the metric that matters. Kodak wasn't losing a technical argument by selling 110. They changed which argument was being had. Compare that to how 35mm was being marketed at the exact same time to hobbyists, professionals, and serious enthusiasts, with specs and lens systems and shutter speeds front and center. Two completely different value systems, aimed at two completely different audiences. And Kodak's cartridge systems were aimed at the vastly larger one. And look, this wasn't Kodak conceding that quality-focused photography didn't matter at all. There were even a handful of more advanced cameras built around Kodak's cartridge formats, like the Zeiss Icon Contaflex 126, a genuine single-lens reflex camera adapted to take the 126 cartridge, aimed at people who wanted a bit more control without giving up the drop in convenience. But those stayed a small niche within a niche. The serious money, the real installed base, the multi-generational family habit, that all lived in the simple point and shoot end of the lineup, because that's where the actual population was. Enthusiasts were a rounding error next to soccer moms and dads with a station wagon full of kids. Cause number 4, infrastructure. This is the boring sounding one. That actually might be the most powerful one. Kodak didn't just sell you the camera and the film. Through the 60s and 70s, Kodak also had an absolutely dominant grip on photo finishing, the actual processing and printing of your pictures. Drugstores, supermarkets, drive-up kiosks like the photomat booths that used to sit in parking lots everywhere. This entire consumer ecosystem was built around dropping off a Kodak cartridge and picking up an envelope of prints a few days later. When your film format is a proprietary Kodak cartridge, and the processing network is built around handling that exact cartridge efficiently and cheaply, you've created a closed loop. It's the razor and blades model, except the razor is the camera, and the blades are an endless supply of cartridges that only really makes sense within Kodak's own retail and processing infrastructure. Standard 35mm was more of an open ecosystem. Tons of manufacturers, tons of processing options, more competition, thinner margins for Kodak specifically. The proprietary, worse format wasn't an accident. It was a moat. Think about the actual customer journey Kodak had built for itself here. You buy the Kodak camera, you buy the Kodak cartridge, you shoot your pictures, you drive up to the photomat booth in the strip mall parking lot, or you drop the cartridge off at the drugstore counter, and a few days later you come back for an envelope of prints. And then, often as not, you buy another Kodak cartridge on your way out the door, because now you're already there, and you might as well restock. Every single step of that loop, from the camera in the box to the prints in your hand, ran through Kodak's own retail relationships. A photographer shooting standard 35mm had dozens of film brands to choose from and dozens of labs competing for their processing dollar. A family shooting 126 or 110 had, functionally, one company controlling almost the entire chain. That's not a minor commercial advantage. That's the difference between selling a product and owning a customer. And cause number 5, the one that seals the deal: timing and scale. The 1960s and 70s were the peak of the post-war. Suburban boom station wagons, family road trips, the birth of mass-market tourism, and a massive, first-time ever wave of middle-class families who wanted to document their lives but had zero technical photography background and zero interest in getting any. That audience was enormous, and it was hungry for exactly the kind of foolproof, pocketable, drop-and-shoot product Kodak had built. Serious 35mm shooters were a comparatively small, specialized market. Kodak wasn't fighting for the enthusiast dollar. It built an entirely new mass market underneath the enthusiast market, and that new market dwarfed it in volume. Around 10 million 1:26 format cameras alone were manufactured across Kodak and its many licensees. That is not a niche product. That's a cultural fixture. And the 110 line leaned even harder into that same wave a decade later, because by 1972, the market had shifted again. Travel got cheaper, air travel expanded, and people wanted a camera that didn't need its own bag. The Pocket Instamatic wasn't competing against 35mm SLRs in most customers' heads at all. It was competing against leaving the camera at home, against not bothering. Kodak's own advertising from the period leaned hard into exactly this pitch: little camera, big pictures, something that fits in your pocket and costs less than $23. That's not a pitch built around resolution charts. That's a pitch built around removing the last possible excuse not to buy one. So let's zoom out for a second, because I don't want you to think this is just a weird footnote about old cameras. This is a pattern that shows up constantly, everywhere, once you know how to look for it. The best spec loses to the good enough, frictionless, and everywhere option again and again throughout history. It's the same basic shape as VHS, beating Betamax despite Betamax having better picture quality, because VHS tapes recorded longer and the format spread faster through rental stores. It's the same shape as compressed MP3 audio, beating lossless formats for 2 straight decades, because file size and convenience mattered more to most listeners than the audio quality trained ears could actually detect. It's even the same shape as the humble QWERTY keyboard layout, which by most typing efficiency studies isn't the fastest possible arrangement of letters, but it got there first. Everybody learned it, and every alternative since has had to fight not just physics, but 100 years of muscle memory. Being technically superior has never been the same thing as being the thing people actually choose, because people aren't optimizing for a lab chart. They're optimizing for their actual life. How much effort something takes, how it fits into their existing habits, and whether the extra quality is even something they can perceive in the way they're going to use it. And look, guys, here's the twist within the twist. Because history's not done with this story yet. 110 didn't win forever. By the mid-1970s, sales already started softening, right as autofocus and cheaper automatic 35mm point-and-shoot cameras started closing the convenience gap without giving up the negative size. Photography magazines that had run dedicated monthly columns just for the 110 format quietly discontinued them by the late 1970s, because there just wasn't enough new happening in the format to justify the coverage. Once 35mm cameras got just as easy to load and just as automatic to shoot, the one advantage 110 actually had, pure convenience, stopped being unique to it, and the format's built-in quality disadvantage finally started mattering again. And here's the part I find almost a little funny. In a history repeats itself, but nobody in the room notices kind of way. Kodak tried the exact same trick one more time in 1982, with an even tinier format called the disc camera. Same core pitch, as always. Smaller, simpler, more convenient, drop-in loading, no fumbling. Except this time it flopped hard. The negative on disc film was so microscopic that even Kodak's own processing technology of the era couldn't fully compensate for it, and by 1982, buyers had spent nearly a decade getting used to expecting genuinely sharp, clean prints out of their convenient little cameras, because 35mm automatics had quietly raised the baseline for what convenient was even allowed to look like. The formula that worked flawlessly in 1963 and worked again in 1972 collapsed completely on its third attempt, not because the idea changed, but because the market around it had. Kodak kept running the same play a beat too late, after the defense had already adjusted. That's genuinely one of my favorite parts of this whole story, guys. The lesson didn't stay learned. It just stopped being true at the exact moment Kodak assumed it always would be. Smaller and simpler wins wasn't a law of nature. It was a specific answer to a specific set of circumstances, a market full of first-time, non-technical shooters competing against genuinely clunky loading mechanisms. And the second those circumstances changed, the rule quietly flipped, and nobody sent out a memo. Which, honestly, brings it right back to you guys. Because you're living the exact same trade-off every single day, and probably don't think about it. That phone in your pocket has a sensor dramatically smaller than a professional camera's, a lens a fraction the size and quality of what a working photographer uses, and computational tricks smoothing over the physics it can't beat. A dedicated mirrorless camera will destroy your phone on every single technical spec: dynamic range, low light performance, lens sharpness, all of it. Put a real camera and a phone side by side. Shoot the exact same scene at night, and the difference is honestly not even close. And yet, the overwhelming majority of photos taken on this entire planet, right now, today, are shot on phones. Not because phones are technically better. They are not. It's because the phone is already in your hand. It requires zero threading, zero loading, zero separate trip to a drugstore, and the results look completely fine on the screen. You're actually going to look at them on. Sound familiar? It's 1963 and 1972 all over again, just with silicon instead of a plastic cartridge. The math genuinely has not changed. Bigger sensor still wins on paper, every single time, and functionally, for almost everybody. Almost nothing changed anyway, because convenience keeps eating quality for breakfast, decade after decade, format after format. So next time you're scrolling through your camera roll, wondering why your vacation photos look a little soft blown up on a big screen, you can blame a guy with a lung condition who invented the perfect format back in 1925, and a company that decided twice that perfect wasn't actually what people wanted to buy. And maybe, just maybe, cut yourself a little slack the next time you pick the easier option over the correct one. Turns out you're in good company. An entire industry's been doing it for 100 years. Alright, that's the one for today. If you had no idea a tiny plastic film cartridge had this much drama behind it, let me know down in the comments. And tell me if you've still got an old Instamatic sitting in a drawer somewhere, because I guarantee some of you do. Drop your take, hit like if this one surprised you, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the stuff that should have won and didn't. I'll catch you guys in the next one.